Okay, thank you. Next topic is about patient recruitment, and specifically the idea of expanding patient recruitment and reaching new patients. So as you know, as everyone knows, patient recruitment is the number one challenge for the industry. It probably always has been, always will be. Um, what do you think is the potential for decentralized trials to address this? Do you think that decentralized trials or having more of those components has the potential to expand clinical trial participation?
Like if you don't mind starting, like that's exactly where my passion is. I think, and actually prior to COVID-19, the pandemic, the centralized clinical trial as a concept existed exactly because of patient recruitment. Because the real problem and challenge of the clinical research industry is how do we recruit and retain patients. The longer timelines are coming from the fact that it's so super hard and it's getting even harder to recruit patients. I'm not going to quote numbers. We all know the numbers. They're really high when it comes to percentage. Why the centralized clinical trials will actually will make the biggest difference for patient recruitment. Because I've been working in patient recruitment, and even today, like on a daily basis, we support patients to apply for clinical trials through our infrastructure. And I can tell you that of course, there are all sorts of reasons why patients cannot end up in a clinical trial. But for example, to 2020 was a big step forward. Society started thinking about clinical trials and research, and people were more open. But even though it's again the same barrier, I'm too away from the site, or I can't, like my schedule is such that I can't visit the site 3 times a week. I'm in such a pain that I can't imagine like this doing this procedure that way. I'm not saying that this is always the case, but because I want to give a contrary example, in Poland, like some maybe a year or two ago, they introduced the remote nursing solution for a clinical trial in a rare disease, and actually it happened to be catastrophic because it turned out that for this particular disease, cultural wise, people were not so happy to not see their doctor because they were used to. So I'm not saying that this is the cure, but I'm saying that in majority of clinical trials, this will definitely improve the patient's experience. The only fact that you provide flexibility, and especially I hope one day also providing the choice to the patient, how do you want to have the clinical trial set up so that it fits you and your schedule, that will bring a tremendous change.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have to agree with you. Oh, Edie, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just gonna say. I mean, I echo. I'm sitting over here, go like preach, preach.
Yeah.
I echo that. You know, where I think it fits and is very analogous in the United States for me, just my own personal experience, is rural health. I mean, you know, you were seeing a massive uptick in your heavier rural spaces in the United States, which I happen to live in a state that is has one of the larger rural health hospital associations, as well as is, you know, absolute 49 out of 50 in terms of, you know, worst rural health outcomes, right? And so what we were starting to see explored before 2020 went sideways, before COVID took over our lives, was those rural health facilities tapping into your large metro facilities or academic medical centers. And it was happening through telehealth modalities so that they could offer better space. And having grown up in a rural area, having a lot of family members who've chosen rural health as their, you know, scope, we were seeing incredible turnaround. Infant maternal mortality rates were improving in my state over it. Psychological and mental health offerings and support were much better because they just don't have that at that rural site. And if you get the patient to come in once, that's the only contact you're going to have. If they go home, they're not going to follow up. They don't have anyone to follow up with, right? And so it was already on the precipice of having this incredible turnaround for certain spaces. I think it can only do more in terms of communities and geographic and language reach. What were you going to say, Daniel?
I was going to say that I agree that decentralized trials are a step in the direction of improving patient recruitment. But what I want to be cautious about, and what me and my colleagues have been noticing, my BIPOC community, BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, People of Color community in clinical research, is that we want to be and we want to sound the alarm on using decentralized trials and the conversation of decentralized trials as the cure all for diversifying and being more inclusive with clinical trials. You're right. You're right that DCTs will go into the rural areas. You're correct that it is a step in the right direction for simplifying an already burdensome experience. However, and I'm going to shout out to Brittany Sloan, my colleague at USC, for putting me on to Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And one of the things that we identify is that we're all in different, levels of this hierarchy. And when we talk about the most underserved communities of color, we're operating in the physiological needs of where are we going to get food, where are we going to get water, where am I going to get rent from, where is the safety needs of security, can I walk down the street to go get a bag of chips and make it back to my house without being harassed or assaulted by police, right? And so when you're talking about including that community, decentralized trials is definitely a step in the right direction, but there is still quite the large gap to go there, because I think that the clinical trial process, recruitment, and even DCT in general, the approach that they take there can, if the goal is to increase patient, recruitment, then yes, we're moving the needle. But if the goal is to increase a more diverse and inclusive research population, there's work to be done to move that needle, right? You can't just say we're going to deploy this and then, yes, the folks in the rural area that you're reaching are folks that are technologically savvy, that have the know-how and appreciation to care about their health enough to participate in a clinical trial. But then when you look at the data, you're still going to see a spread that is not inclusive of those communities.
No, I think that's a great point. It's not a panacea. I thought about that this morning when I was prepping for this and I was reading through and I'm like, we want it to be so badly, right? Because we know it's needed, but there's other areas that doesn't address, right?
Yeah.
As it relates to it.
I would actually argue with you because yes and no, because maybe it doesn't address that much if we understand the centralized clinical trials of what they are today. And today, what they are is kind of a mix between remote nursing, remote delivery of drug, plus some kind of remote, let's say, visits and e-pros and stuff, and that's what it is today. But I don't think that the concept of the centralized clinical trials is just that. I think that's just the beginning, and I think I shared with you the reason why I'm so passionate about the centralized clinical trials. It has nothing to do with like this remote support. Actually, the reason why I got involved with Find Me Cure, with everything that I'm doing, is the fact that I was searching for a clinical trial for my sister. My sister is based out of Bulgaria. The clinical trial she was eligible for was in the UK. I wish one day, and I imagine one day, that the centralized clinical trial will allow her to be a part of this clinical trial, no matter in which country she is. And that would not mean technology advancement or maybe like remote services like the ones that we are now describing. It would mean rethinking of the role of the investigator, the sub-investigator, maybe identifying new roles, maybe new type of investigator, principal investigator, monitoring other investigators remotely, etc. If the patient is eligible, if the treatments and the therapies can be done in the location, it shouldn't matter where
and
this
safely.
patient. Exactly.
And safely, yeah.
And safety, yes, of course, safety is always like first. But
Yeah.
if these are things like in place, and it shouldn't matter who this patient is, where this patient is coming from, and anything. And actually, I think that the pharmaceutical world and clinical research, and I would say actually pharmaceutical world, is starting to understand diversity as importance even more now, because COVID-19 clinical research proved them that actually if they're going in the same direction, they will have not the right results. They're looking efficiency. They are racing for the best vaccine and treatment for COVID-19 over there. But because they saw that COVID-19 affects different people differently, they also see that efficiency in the end of the day varies as well.
Yeah.
And I can't tell you how many like sponsors I've spoken to addressing this, saying that how do we reach Black community? Well, the main problem here is that so far you've been working with the big research centers where mainly Caucasian people have been there because they can afford it, etc. And you go every time in the places where they have already experienced. Well, maybe now it's the time to think, how can we empower the research naive practices and hospitals and not be afraid of going there because they don't have experience, because that's what the feasibility expert will tell you.
Yes.
I know it's better to go to the site that has experience. That's one of the number one thing they're looking at.
Yep.
But why not thinking, how can we empower these research naive hospitals?
Well, and then you're going where the patients are. So the recruitment actually, right, becomes an easier retention issue to control because you're going to where you already know you have a patient population that may be eligible. You just have to actually get that physician practice or that, small health center or otherwise not research related entity to come into the research world. You're back ending instead of saying, I only look at people with experience, and then that's how I get to my recruitment. It's a new way, right? It's a new way of reaching the algorithm. I also think from a compliance perspective, given the hat I often wear, so recruitment is the scariest thing to someone like myself because I so heavily recognize that someone, even a person who's, affluent of means, it was no problem for them to get to the major site at the major AMC hub. Still, that's time out of their day. That's time out of their caregiver's day. And when you have a coordinator or a PI come to you and say, I know this patient is eligible, but they have to go back to wherever they're from tomorrow. And I can't get this hospital in this other place to give me their records, even though they've released them. And until I have the records in hand and I can verify, blah, 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 per protocol, I can't enroll them, which means we are just wasting their time. They're just sitting in the waiting room today. And as the compliance person, that sends me into orbit. I'm on the phone immediately. And the thing is, no one wants that patient to be sitting in the waiting room unattended to. No one wants that patient to not get on the trial and not seek an innovative therapy. Yeah. That hospital is terrified that they're going to release the records and they're going to violate HIPAA and they're going to get sued, right? And then the next person is scared because, right, there's all these logistics. And so the best thing you can do is be operationally prepared, right? And try to work ahead. But that just does not always work when you are on such a tight clock and you only have this person in town at your site for a certain amount of time. Things just happen. I think we're doing better with it, especially now that we've gotten the hang of remote life, and we're actually using the technology that was there before 2020, right? But at the same time, it's still a compliance. You're just fearful, right? That it's not going to go right. Every little variable has to go just right for that to work. Well, if you knew that even if you sent them home and they were dealing with their own physician or their own care, think about how that could change the timing and think about how much more flexible you could be in how you apply that regulatory compliance and still meet muster, still have, paramount safety, right? But do it in a way that's not so tight and compliant. Because the other part of it too is from an operational perspective, when you end up having to pivot in a day to spend your whole day dealing with that particular patient because they're the one who's on site, that means somebody else or some other issue operationally doesn't get your attention. So that doesn't work long term. It can't be like that.
Yeah. And this gets to, I think, Maya's point that there needs to be a certain maturing of the whole infrastructure, right? Because what you're describing is part of a broader problem, which is the accessibility of medical records, right? And the fact that we're still struggling with this, even though it was supposed to have been fixed 10 years ago. The question, so I think we're all in consensus that decentralized trials removes the barriers to participation and makes it more accessible because it brings it meets the patient closer to where they're at. But as you point out, Daniel, if it's not if you don't have the right investigator mix or you're not represented in the right communities, it's not necessarily going to address diversity. It strikes me that another issue here is awareness. I had a colleague who's from the industry who went to a pharmacy to get COVID tested, and then he was asked, do you want to participate in a trial? He said yes, or are you open to it? Then he got information about the trial, and of course it's decentralized, there are a lot of options. So that's great, but if it weren't for that checkbox, which I thought was very innovative, you might not have gone out and sought out a clinical trial. And I know it's actually sort of hard to figure out what trials are enrolling where and how to get in. It's actually not that easy because it's all decentralized information. So is there more work the industry can do in your mind to increase not just awareness that clinical trials exist, but like finding the patients that have a need or eligibility for a clinical trial and getting them at the right time? How do you solve that? That seems harder to solve.
I would say from a structural standpoint, revamp clinicaltrials.gov. We are in 2021. Okay, there's no reason why I should be going to clinicaltrials.gov and seeing it's like I'm on Netscape Explorer. And the thing is, that's an industry issue that needs to be addressed. Okay, if I sat my 62-year-old Hispanic mother at a computer and said, find a trial, she's gonna get up and say, I forget it. I don't even know what button to click. Okay, so make that user friendly, make that process user friendly. You know, one of the organizations I'm involved with is Clinical Trials in Color. Again, shout out to Brandy Starks for founding such an amazing platform that is seeking to do exactly that. And it's just to have a conversation around clinical research, taking a bit of more of a social media approach, if you will, and frankly meeting people where they're at and saying, don't come to us, let's create a platform. We're done waiting for the industry to make clinicaltrials.gov sexy, so we're just going to come and have a conversation and meet you where you're at. So I think that's part of it. There's engagement. There is the fact that if you're talking about diversifying clinical trial populations, are those folks actually getting to the right COVID testing place to where they're being handed a clipboard so that the checkbox is even put in front of them? Okay, so there's that gap we have to address, right? And then once we've addressed that gap, then yes, you need to empower where they're getting care to be able to offer those clinical trials. So it's a put your mask on first type of a scenario with community health.
Yeah, I want to also I agree with you, Daniel, about the city.gov. And actually, for many reasons, it's not only suitable, not only for patients, but for many other reasons that it's been used. Actually, that's how we started. We decided that we need to revamp and change the way information looks for patients. And we thought it's so easy, actually, that you just simplify the language. Actually, it's more complicated than it sounds, because there are regulations around how do you present clinical trials. And a lot of the information that patients don't get, you can't actually change without going through additional regulatory approval. So that's kind of a complexity, but there is a way. If you go to like our website, you will see that there is a simplified information. Then the next thing is also how do you also educate patients what clinical trials are, because they have no idea, and they're so afraid. They've heard about all of these experiments. One thing we did good is, thanks to COVID again, we brought research in a different light, and usually media is bringing clinical trials only for the negative news. Like, we know in general that media is like working with negative news in general, but clinical trials is a special case. So they always have it like the failures basically are out there, not the success stories. And then one missing piece that we've seen is, okay, what happens after this patient gets aware and like wants to find out more? Like, how do you connect them with what happens next? Because believe me, the interaction between patient and the investigator, especially sites that have no coordinators, that's a complicated thing. They speak different language, and not even to mention that like sites are so overwhelmed, and speaking with any patient that wants to get information, it's not exactly what they are very excited about. And I can tell you that a lot of patient recruitment companies out there really face this challenge of exactly this referral process and actually not just patient recruitment, even referral programs. They struggle with the referring process to the sites, because sites are kind of reluctant how potential these patients would be, how eligible, and whether they are not going to waste their time. But another layer, actually before that, one good example. City.gov is definitely not a good example, but I can tell you what the UK government did. So after we launched findmecure.com, obviously we attracted a lot of attention. And one of the institutions that got attracted to what we've created was exactly the NIHR. That's the National Institute for Health Research in the UK. What they did, they were super smart. They came to us and said, hey guys, you created something really good. Can you basically share with us the good practices? And they created their own governmental website. In the ideal world, each of the country will have a centralized place dedicated solely for patients, with consultants, coordinators, which is not such a big deal, so that patients can really be kind of with the concierge, basically, like so that patients can be guided in a way. That's super important for the entire industry, because the government also wins from research in the end of the day. But last thing, what actually is super, like if I speak about the ideal world, in the ideal world, we wouldn't depend on people being proactively searching for clinical trials, because that would depend on how intelligent and how, not intelligent, but how aware are you in the end of the day about this happening out there, especially
it's the hierarchy of needs again, right?
Yep.
If you're at the peak of the pyramid, you're thinking about yourself and you're really aware of your needs, right?
Exactly. So we shouldn't wait for that. And actually, that's the whole healthcare is going towards that with all the medical devices, IoT, etc. We actually need, in the ideal world, we should have structured, standardized medical records, electronic medical records, actually electronic health records, because well, that's one level up, that actually suggest the best treatment for you, no matter whether that's clinical trial or not. I know we are far away from that. Believe me, in the States, you're the example there, because in the rest of the countries it's even worse. But in the ideal world, that would be the ultimate solution.
Yeah, and I think that gets into, I would echo everything that both of you just said. And I just love the passion that Maya brings to this conversation and the personal background, right? Because this is really, to me, this is your soapbox, right? And I would just say, as someone who has a deep background in ethics and talks about the history of research ethics and how we get to the regulatory infrastructure, that's one of the pieces that we have to consider. It hasn't gone anywhere. 2020 and COVID didn't make that better. It didn't necessarily make it worse, because it did normalize clinical trials a bit for the average consumer, but it didn't take away our history and our roots and some of the reasons that very certain populations, in addition to having disparity in their accessibility to care and their accessibility to trials, they also have a really bad taste in their mouth from some really bad things that actually happened. Okay, like there's a true history there. And you are talking about hundreds of years of disparity and experience there. And so I think that, from the regulatory perspective, we've done I understand legally why we try to regulatorily separate clinical care as opposed to research. But I think that in decentralized trials, you are moving toward them being closer than they have ever been, right? And they were already riding that line. So as we are able to update our regulations, as we are able to work through and hopefully in time, right, harmonize FDA, EMA, and have, like what you're talking about, Maya, a bigger, more nationalized, standardized structure is the word I'm looking for here. We have to deal with the fact that the only way decentralized trials can truly take off into that vision is if we frankly have research as a part of care, right? They're not, and again, I understand that's so much easier said than done. But I think if we're already going to be rehashing our infrastructure, if we're already talking about updating regulations that desperately need it for the technologies that are present,
yeah, let's go for the big ones.
Let's do it all, because the reality is, like you said, if you had this incredible system where you could look at a patient and say what their trials might be eligible for and give them their options across several geographic issues and different types or areas and different types of trials, why would regulatory be the one thing that holds us back from that?
Yeah, true.
Well, we can keep going on and on about this topic, because I feel like we just barely scratched the surface. But thank you all very much. This was a very helpful conversation. If I could just summarize it, I think we all agree tremendous potential to lower barriers, but it's sort of the beginning or at the early stages of a very long-term journey where a lot of other things have to come in place to sort of realize the true potential of decentralized trials, expanding reach to different populations.